Hey everyone, welcome to the Journey Home podcast. This week we are continuing our series on discipleship, and I have titled this episode, We Cannot Be His Disciples Unless dot dot dot. And some of you may already maybe can tell where I'm going with that, but I'll explain that in a few minutes. But if you've been listening, this is now the 11th episode that I've done on this topic of discipleship. And so, it's a longer series, and I did want to really take my time with this because it's such an important topic. I think discipleship is very clearly meant to be, always was meant to be a major emphasis of the church. And, I think the question that all of us who claim to be disciples of Jesus need to be asking is, are we making disciples the way that Jesus did, that the early church did? Have we strayed from the biblical parameters and definitions of what it means to be a disciple? And, of course, we look at the church today, across the globe. Of course, it's impossible to summarize it in just one or two statements because, churches in other nations, other parts of the world are, have different challenges than we might have here in the West, here in the United States. And so, you can't put everyone just in the same category. But that being said, as someone who is seeking to be a faithful disciple of Jesus in the United States in this context, I think it's fair to say at the very least that there's room for improvement in our discipleship and our disciple making efforts, if not, that we're at an all out crisis. And I think some would say that. And I think, I think there is a case to be made for sure. But wherever you fall on your level of concern for the state of the church right now and the state of our discipleship, I hope that we can agree at the very least. There's definitely room for improvement. And so that being said, that's why I did want to really take my time with this series and, not rush through it. And so, as I said, today's episode, and I've shared in a few previous episodes, just different scriptures where Jesus, explicitly gives us either a definition or something that he is expecting or requiring of his disciples. Last week I shared, he said, they will know we are his disciples by our love for one another. And so that's just one example of several that I've shared with you. But this week, I want to share something that Jesus said to his disciples. But it wasn't just that, this is what he expects from his disciples. He actually said that we cannot be his disciples if we don't do this. So, it's just a little different way of, probably saying the same thing. But at the very least, that makes it stand out to me. It's one thing to say, if you do this, then you're my disciples. But it's another thing to say, if you don't do this, then you cannot, meaning like this is a hard line. This is a prerequisite. And if we don't obey this, then we cannot consider ourselves, we cannot call ourselves his disciples. And so, so there's two scriptures I'm going to share with you. First is Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 21. He's talking to his disciples, and he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And so you do see in the Gospels, there's kind of this turning point where he begins to share these kinds of things with his disciples. And it's implied perhaps that, he hadn't shared it up until that point, right? And so, and then he continues, he says to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. So that's the first place where Jesus talks about this idea of denying ourselves, carrying our cross, and following him. And then later in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, starting at verse 25, he says that it says this: large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. And so the first verse I read, it's kind of him saying, if you're going to be my disciple, then you need to do this. But in the second one, it's, as I said earlier, this is where he says, if you don't carry your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. And so I think this is, clearly a very important lesson or truth that Jesus is teaching his disciples. And then, of course, he's teaching us as well. So let me start actually by talking about what denying ourselves and carrying our crosses doesn't mean, because I think there's a lot of room for misunderstanding. And in all my years of studying the scriptures and attempting to, live as a disciple, I've seen, this explained different ways and taught different ways. And so I'm familiar, at least a little bit, with some of the misunderstandings of this passage, of this truth, right? So my first point is that when he's talking about denying ourselves, carrying our crosses, he is not talking about us paying the penalty for our sins or the price of atonement. No matter how guilty, how bad you might feel about your sin, you need to know that the price has already been paid. God is not, when he calls you to carry the cross, it's not because he wants you to suffer as a way of paying for that sin, right? Like, that is not what this is about. And I think sometimes we can believe that, out of our own self, guilt or our self-hatred, even, like, we almost want to be punished because we feel so guilty. And that's not what God is asking for. When Jesus died on the cross, he said, "It is finished." He was speaking of, paying the price, paying the penalty for our sin, the price of our atonement. It is finished once and for all. It does not need to be added to. It cannot be taken away from, and that is good news, right? You and I do not have to bear the penalty or the price for our sin in that regard. And so again, when he's talking about carrying a cross, that's not what he is referring to. Secondly, it's not about self-hatred, self-harm. Those are very real things in our world today. And sadly, I think religion without understanding the grace of God and the gospel, the good news, sadly, I think can lead some. I don't think it's the only cause, but I think it definitely is a cause for some, for self-hatred, even self-harm. And that's tragic to me, because I don't believe that is anywhere close to what God is asking of us either. He's not calling us to carry our cross because he wants to see us suffer. He wants to see us, beat ourselves up or cause ourselves harm. Like, that does not bring him pleasure. That doesn't bring him glory. And so it's not that either. And thirdly, it's not like, a Christian call to become like a masochist or something, like someone who seeks out pain or enjoys pain, right? Like, that is not what God is after either, because then otherwise we should all just wake up every day and say, what's the most painful thing I can do to myself, right? If that's what he meant by denying ourselves and carrying our cross, like, that's the question we should be asking. But I really don't believe that that's what he's asking us for. It's not about seeking out pain, intentionally, right? And so, okay, so if it doesn't mean those things, then what does it mean? So let's start with what I think is probably the most literal and obvious application, because, again, that first passage, Luke chapter 9, Jesus begins to tell them that he is going to to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer. He's going to be crucified, but he will rise again. And so immediately after that, he begins to call his disciples to essentially be willing to do the same. Again, not, for the three reasons I just listed, but just because, that's if he's setting that example for us, then we should also be willing to suffer. And so I think the most obvious application of the passage is martyrdom, right? Which I know in the minds of a lot of Christians, like that's the ultimate, right? Like that's the ultimate price you could pay for the Lord or for your faith, right? That's the ultimate thing you could do. And I think sometimes, honestly, we romanticize it a little bit. But that being said, we shouldn't do that. But again, that being said, like I think we should all be willing to literally lay our life down for the Lord, for the gospel, if necessary. And I say if necessary because I don't believe that every believer will end up doing that. But I think many, many have, first of all, throughout history and even today. For some, I'm sure a lot of you know that, but for some people that might be news to you. Like, if you're used to growing up in a Christianized or even a post-Christian context, like you might think that that's only something that happened in the days of the early church, but surely not now, right, in the 21st century. But there are believers at this very moment whose lives are on the line and who are literally laying their lives down because they are following Jesus and they refuse to deny him, right? And so that is a very real thing. That's a very sobering thing and a serious thing, of course. But I believe every single one of us should be willing to, literally die and suffer for the Lord if it comes to it. Again, I'm not saying we should seek it out, but, there are some contexts where, you don't have to seek it out. It will find you. It will, that threat is always there. And for many believers, we know that this is how they will express their obedience and their love for the Lord is by laying their life down. And that is a powerful thing. And so it's a holy thing before the Lord. And so that's, I think, the first and most obvious application. The second one is, you might not ultimately be martyred for your faith, but that's why I think Jesus says, you deny yourself and carry your cross daily. Again, if it's about actually dying and laying our life down, you can't do that daily. It's really only something you can only do one time, right? But that's the thing. Carrying our cross, it can mean that, but it can also just mean my second point, which is we're willing to follow and obey Jesus every day, even if it means suffering, right? Even if it means suffering. And again, I'm not saying we intentionally go out and seek the suffering, but trust me, if you are genuinely seeking to follow, obey Jesus, to be his disciple, there will come times where you will suffer. And it might not be physical pain that you'll suffer. It might be other things like rejection or mocking or, other kinds of persecution. But those will come if you are, genuinely following Jesus. And again, I'm not saying that, we wake up every day trying to find it. But when it comes, we recognize that he warned us about this, he told us about this, and he called us to live this way and to still follow him despite, whatever suffering our obedience may require of us, and, I think depending on how you've been taught, how you've been discipled, my hope is that you've heard that, but I find that, a lot of pastors probably don't love to preach about from this passage because, it can turn people off. It can, scare some people, honestly, because, no one wants to suffer. Even Jesus didn't want to suffer, but he was willing to suffer, for our sake. But that doesn't mean he was a masochist, right? And so, and the same way, like, most people don't want to suffer. And so this can be a very challenging scripture to teach to your church. But at the same time, like Jesus said, if you don't do this, you cannot be my disciple. So at a certain point, we can't avoid it if we're going to be faithful to the scriptures and be faithful to the Lord. Um, but there is this thing called the prosperity gospel. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. And I think most people, when they think of prosperity gospel, they think, oh, those are the people who think God's going to make them rich and give them huge luxury houses, luxury cars, planes, private planes, all these things. And of course that is an aspect of the prosperity gospel. But there's a more subtle form of the prosperity gospel where maybe you're not expecting God to give you all these material blessings, but maybe you think, well, if I'm faithful to Jesus, then he'll keep me safe, he'll keep my family safe, and we won't suffer pain or persecution. But actually that goes directly against a lot of the scripture, right? Like, we are taught to expect persecution. We're taught to expect to be hated for the sake of his name. And so again, I think that can be a more subtle version of the prosperity gospel that we don't necessarily realize we're buying into. And again, I'm not saying you're guaranteed to suffer or be martyred, but we have to recognize, if we're following Jesus, we have to at least be willing to do that, and we shouldn't be surprised by that if it comes our way. So that's my second one. The third is very similar, but it's that we're willing to follow and obey Jesus daily, even when it has a cost. And so, the first one, the previous point, I'm emphasizing more suffering, but there are other costs that we might pay, that might not be like physical suffering. It might not even be persecution, but there are sacrifices, there are costs to following Jesus, to loving God and loving our neighbor as he calls us to do. And so, and sometimes I find that Christians, this is a foreign concept to them. Like, we're not even willing to be inconvenienced, let alone sacrifice or pay a cost. But again, discipleship does have a cost. Following Jesus does have a cost. And that's why we have to be willing to deny ourselves, pick up our cross daily, and follow him, right? And so, there's so much more that we can say about, what does it mean to carry our cross? But I think I've given you at least, some of the most obvious and big applications of that. And so, finally, I just want to say that, again, this whole call to deny ourselves, to carry our cross, to follow him, it's not about paying him back. It's not like a guilt trip, where Jesus is like, look how much I suffered for you. Now you should be willing to, suffer for me. It's not about that. That's not his motivation. I don't think he wants that to be our motivation. But really, I think our willingness to follow him in this way, even if there's a cost, even if it means suffering, even if it means laying our lives down, it's not because we're so hardcore. It's not because we're so tough. Actually, I think it's evidence that we've truly been transformed by his love, because love gives, love sacrifices, love is willing to pay a cost, just as, Jesus said, this is the greatest, there's no greater love than this, that I lay my life down for my friends, right? And so if that is the ultimate expression of love, then we should be willing to lay our lives down. Again, I'm not talking about abuse. I'm not talking about like, subjecting ourselves to things like that. I'm talking about something that is done to you that you don't have a choice in. I'm not talking about that. That's different conversation. I'm talking about you willingly sacrificing, you willingly paying a cost because of the love of God that compels you, not for some other reason, right? But I think if we get to the point in our discipleship where we're willing to suffer for the Lord, to pay the cost, it shows that his love has truly done its work in our hearts, and it's truly transformed us. Again, it's not just a concept in our head that we can write the correct answer on a theology quiz, right? Like, it means his love has actually transformed us. And it also means that we actually believe that he is who he said he is, and we also believe that his kingdom is what he said it is. Because if we believe in his kingdom, we know that this life is not the end of the story. It's not the be all end all. And so if we have to sacrifice, if we do have to, give up certain things in this life, it's not just because, we're so, selfless and generous, but we know that there's a reward waiting for us in his kingdom, right? Like, yes, Jesus went to the cross because of his love, but he also went, as the Bible tells us, for the joy that was set before him. And he knew that there was a reward. He knew that there was something beyond this life. And that, I believe, is part of the reason why he could lay his life down. But it should be the same for us. And I think if we can get to this point, it is evidence that we actually believe he is who he said he is, and that his kingdom is what he said it is. And so, yeah, so the call to carry our cross, it can sound scary, it can be a very sobering thing, and it is. I'm not denying that, but at the same time, it can be a very joyful thing, And as with many things, the kingdom, it's counterintuitive, right? He said, if you seek to hold on to your life, you cling to this life, and you don't want to let it go, you're gonna lose it. But if you're willing to lose your life for his sake, that's how you'll actually find your life. And so it doesn't make sense logically sometimes, but that's the way his kingdom works. And so there is a joy in living this way. There is a joy that's found in denying ourselves and carrying our cross. And so yeah, but again, just remember, and I hope this is either encouraging you or challenging you, but he said we cannot be his disciple if we don't carry our cross, if we don't deny ourselves and follow him daily. And so, yeah, I hope that this has helped and challenged you. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.